Fantastically corrupt. That's the hashtag trending on Twitter on the eve of a long-planned anti-corruption summit, all because of this.
We've had a very successful cabinet meeting this morning. We were talking about our anti-corruption summit. We've got the Nigerians. We've got some leaders of some fantastically corrupt countries coming to Britain. Nigeria and Afghanistan, possibly the two most corrupt countries.
But this particular president is actually not corrupt. No, he's trying very hard.
They are coming soon. They'll be very keen on a little bit.
That open mic indiscretion comes in what was never going to be an easy week for the British Prime Minister, not after the Cameron name surfaced in the Panama Papers revelations about offshore trusts. Yes, subjects of Her Gracious Majesty the Queen, as well as Nigerians, Afghans, citizens from all over the world, like to park their money in sunny destinations far from those pesky tax collectors. Tax havens, by the way, aren't only crown dependencies with nice beaches. Everywhere from Singapore and Luxembourg to the Netherlands and the U.S. state of Delaware can be a good place to store money elsewhere. So will the London Anti-Corruption Summit, what will it achieve? Should they follow the recommendation of a petition of more than 300 economists calling for an end to tax havens? Will public anger lead to change? Or is it all water under London Bridge? Today in the France 24 debate, fantastically corrupt is the buzzword. With us, a man who helped, whose boss signed on to that petition of economists, Pierre Habart of the Trade Union Advisory Committee. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Joining us from London, Chazroy Chaudhuri, who's the go-to man on tax matters at the Chartered Accounts Association, ACCA Global, which works with the EU's small business umbrella group. Thank you for being with us.
Good evening. Thank you.
And we welcome back to the show Friederike Roeder, France Director for Anti-Poverty Advocacy Group 1. Thank you for joining us. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. After the blunder, British politics always serves up that cathartic follow-up they call Parliament Questions Time.
The Prime Minister in his comments about Nigeria and Afghanistan and ask him if he will stop pouring hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money into those and other corrupt countries until they've cleaned up their act.
Countries like Nigeria and Afghanistan, their leaders are battling hard against very corrupt systems and countries. And in both their cases, they've made some remarkable steps forward. And that's why I'm so keen to welcome them to the Anti-Corruption Conference here in London. But where I part company with my honourable friend is I don't think it'd be right to withdraw the aid that we give. Because frankly, the problems in those countries, they come back and haunt us here.
Pierre Habart, do you agree with the Prime Minister? How did he handle that there from what you just heard?
Well, there is, I guess the issue is whether this summit will deliver tomorrow. I mean, there is indeed this discussion about whether Nigeria, Afghanistan are indeed corrupted countries. The most important behind this is whether tomorrow, when leaders meet, whether they will come up with some clear commitment. On our side, I guess for the NGO world in general, for the labour movement, there may be three issues. First, making sure that that we all understand that corruption is linked to tax evasion issues. These are different animals, but they are using the same instruments. But also links with more soft, aggressive tax planning. That's the first test, making sure we have a comprehensive approach. Secondly, understand that financial transparency and tax transparency matters to all. It does matter to anti-corruption authorities, to the tax collector, but it does matter to citizens. And that's a call that the 300 economists sign on and a letter by the Oxfam is to call for country-by-country reporting and to call for public disclosure of beneficial ownership. The third point, and that's with how do you deter and prevent corruption, but also tax evasion practices, and perhaps we can have some time to discuss this, it's about whistleblower protection. Protect those who stand up in the company, in the public administration, protect them who stand up and who alert on the malpractices.
So the Panama Papers come out long after this summit had been scheduled. It was scheduled a long time ago. But you're saying actually that actually this issue of tax evasion is at the core of the problem of corruption?
What is at the core is opacity, and opacity over identity of who are the ultimate owners, and about complexity of the investment chain, complexity, the use of many financial intermediaries. You can use that for corruption purpose, but also for pure tax evasion purpose. As we understand what comes out of the Panama Papers, okay, there are indeed some of it which is about corruption, but other transactions are about more classic tax evasion and tax avoidance purpose. So this anti-corruption summit, what we hope is, there have been many summits before, okay, there have been many, and there will be afterwards. The question is, will this actually be a change, a game changer?
All right, on the hashtag F24 debate, 68% of you say that David Cameron should not apologize over the remarks that he was caught making on an open mic. He hasn't so far. We're joined for our discussion now by Najim Animashaun, attorney and who works on issues of energy and development. He joins us from Abuja. Najim, we're going to listen to what your president said. Muhammadu Buhari, who is in London for that summit, saying he doesn't want an apology. Instead, he wants the money from all those Nigerians who've stashed their cash in Britain. Buhari bring up the case of the late governor of oil-rich Bayelsa State.
I'm listening. Anybody. Hello. What I'm demanding is the return of assets. I have already mentioned how Britain really led and how disgraceful one of the Nigerian executive was. He has to dress like a woman to leave Britain and leave behind his bank account and fix the assets, which Britain is prepared to hand over to us. This is what I'm asking for. What would I do with apology? I need something tangible.
Najim Animashaun, there you heard it there. President Buhari evoking that incident in 2005 where the governor dressed as a woman to escape the British authorities. Do you agree with Buhari on this, that there is money that should be handed back to Nigeria?
You know, it's actually quite funny because he's hit the nail right on the head. There is money that should be handed back to Nigeria. There are assets in the UK that are owned by Nigerians that have been acquired through less than transparent means. And the British, although they've been helpful in prosecuting some very corrupt officials like the former governor of Delta State, who's actually in jail in the UK at the moment, have not been as quick in returning the proceeds of crime. This is by contrast to the Swiss, who actually returned over $1 billion over the last 15 years, the last 382 million of which were returned just before the last presidential election that President Buhari won. And the interesting things that are coming out about the last payment of $380-odd million is that as soon as it came into Nigeria, it was shared, it was released in cash to the National Security Advisor to purchase weapons. And the National Security Advisor at the time is now on trial for corruption. And all these revelations came out. So essentially, the money that was recovered was then stolen again. And now we're seeing how the money was applied. The money was distributed by the former National Security Advisor.
Najim,
so
you're making the case. Najim, you're making the case in the same breath for and against handing the money back.
No, I'm making the case for what Mr. Buhari, President Buhari, has said. I want the money back. Because when the money came back under the last administration, it went out again. When the money came back under the administration before, it was tied to the Millennium Development Goals, and a lot of pro-poor spending was what the funds were applied to. And there are a whole bunch of projects that have been done. The Earth Institute in America Jeffrey Sachs was deeply involved in the Millennium Development Goal projects in Nigeria. And that was where much of the Abacha loot was spent. And it was part of the loan forgiveness to the Paris Club of Debtors when we paid off our debt. So yes, it's been applied properly before by the last administration. It was stolen in this particular instance, and we've been able to discover where the money was stolen. So there is a reason to pay it back if President Buhari is to be believed. So yes, you're right.
All right,
you still there?
Yeah, we're still here. I'm going to bring in on this Chas Roy Chowdhury. Chas, you heard Najim Ali Mashoun say there that Switzerland has been quicker to give back ill-gotten gains stashed in their country than the British have. Your reaction?
I think what's been said is perfectly, and your guest in the studio as well, I entirely agree with the things that are being said. I think what we need to realise is that the UK goes through a very stringent due process before acting, and I think it doesn't matter which country is involved, it would be the same due process. So maybe it's more streamlined in jurisdictions like Switzerland, which are more used to this kind of goings-on, being considered to be one of those, quote, tax havens that is under scrutiny. So I think at the end of the day, if there's money owed to a particular country, a particular jurisdiction, which is held in the UK illicitly or ill-gotten gains, it'll find its way back to the right jurisdiction. What I say also to your NGO guest in the studio, I very much agree with what he says. I think we do need transparency. We need to make sure we brush aside the opacity of the way some of the holdings of companies or entities are. They're not easy to find out. But what I would like to see, though, is where there's disclosure in terms of country-by-country reporting, in terms of tax information, it should be to the tax authorities. So the tax information, rather than the holdings information, should be to tax authorities so that people are aware, they are much more willing to be transparent, and we actually make European Union a good place to do business. Because I think at the moment we are at risk of making the European Union a place where it's reputationally risky for businesses, for individuals, and I think we just need to work much harder to get the EU economy onto a fast track for growth rather than the slow track to, no growth at all in many countries.
Oh, so you're making the case for tax harmonization across Europe. Interesting.
I think harmonisation, for example, CCCTB, the Common Consolidated Tax Base, I think that there are some good points about it. I do think that the time has passed. The time for that, the CCCTB, would have been before the global financial crisis. I think there's a sea change in view now from governments. I think there's a lot more opposition to it. But we do have a common tax. We have a VAT system, which, believe it or not, is common. Okay, the rates aren't harmonised. A lot of the deduction rights aren't harmonised. But it's a common tax. And I sit on the expert group that deals with VAT, or two of the expert groups that deal with VAT under the European Commission. And we are doing our best to try and make that system work better. So there are a lot of harmonisation areas already. And we probably need to look at alignment rather than harmonisation, which always gets the hackles up of pretty well every member state of the European Union.
All right, that's a point we'll be picking on later. Again, getting back to those remarks made by David Cameron that were picked up by ITN, Afghan lawmakers also reacting and employing the classic "it takes two to tango" defense line when it comes to corruption.
Corruption exists in Afghanistan, there's no doubt about it. But the United Kingdom itself, America and the international community have had a hand in spreading this corruption. At this stage, when the anti-corruption conference is due to be held in London, we're not expecting the British government to raise this question. This is a clear insult to the Afghan nation.
Federica Roeder, does that line of defense hold up?
I think actually we should, and leaders should stop talking. And what I want to see is some action. I think this debate is, the situation is quite clear. As you said, it takes two to tango. And I think we now know that corruption as well as tax evasion are global problems that, and we can't just pick out one country and say there's a problem in one specific country. It's really a global system. There's someone who's receiving the bribe, there's someone paying the bribe, and there's actually also a third actor who's actually helping to launder the money. And I think what David Cameron now needs to do after these comments is that he needs to take action. Tomorrow is the right day to do so. And I would see two priority actions where he's really the best placed to do something against global corruption that also has an impact actually on very poor countries. One thing is that we know that the UK has a lot of trusts being very opaque legal structures that are being used to launder money coming out of corruption, of tax evasion, of all kinds of illegal activities. At the moment, the UK has not taken the step to open up a register of those who own and who benefit from trusts. So this is the first step to take.
Prime Minister is promising more transparency on that.
He's been promising transparency for years. But what we need now is concrete action, and the proposal is on the table. So what he needs to do is to set up a register for those who own and benefit from trust, something that doesn't exist for the time being, and he needs to open it up to public scrutiny. And he has done this, or he's doing this for companies, for shell companies, but not for trusts. So he's leaving a huge loophole he needs to close. So this is one thing he needs to do. The other thing is that we know that a lot of money is actually going into tax havens that are linked to the UK, that are crown dependencies or overseas territories. So if we look, for instance, at the Panama Papers, more than half of the companies set up by Mossack Fonseca were actually incorporated in territories linked to the UK. So this is also something where we expect David Cameron to take action. So
okay, so what does
we should
what does he do? What does he do in that
about
case?
these
Does he
things.
go, like most of them are what, from the British Virgin Islands is number one?
I think
what does he tell the British Virgin Islands?
I think the solution is on the table. What we need to know is we need to know who's actually behind shell companies and who's hiding behind trusts. So the solution is to set up registers and to open them up to a public scrutiny. And the UK has the legal and the political room of maneuver to also tell overseas territories and crown dependencies to do the same. And this is actually something he has been talking about a lot in the preparation of the summit. And as it was already said, now he needs to deliver tomorrow. And I think, I mean, it's good that we're having the debate, but we shouldn't actually. I mean, we can talk about Nigeria, we can talk about Afghanistan, but I think the most important thing is that every country actually has to do more in the fight against corruption and tax evasion. This is very clear. Everyone has to get their own house in order, and I think it needs to start with the UK because they are actually calling for this summit.
Well, should likewise the French be leaning on Monaco, Andorra, Luxembourg?
Absolutely. I guess, I mean, the most important is to, how do you call it, having a level playing field, okay? So if the UK move, if the French move, everybody should. And there are standards globally. The OECD is running a global forum on tax transparency. There are standards on financial transparency. The British Virgin Islands, as of today, is considered as largely compliant. A priori, it's mission accomplished for them. Obviously, it is not. So what we need is to strengthen those standards on transparency, better access to indeed a beneficial ownership. Two small points here. The case of Nigeria shows that we need a comprehensive approach. In the reporting that was given, we heard words like sustainable development goals, development aid, tax evasion, corruption. At the international level, there still is a silo approach. These are being dealt separately by different forums, and we are not connecting the dots.
We're going to get Najim Animashoun's reaction to that when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.